Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have it ready hot, fresh, and fast. Whether it's lunch on the go, dinner with friends, or a full-on fiesta at home, Cafe Rio always brings the flavor and the fun. So what are you waiting for? We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you on another week. It's bye week. Hopefully you're enjoying the bye week. You're getting some time off. You get to just sit back, relax, enjoy college football in a non-stressful way. Your team is ranked high. We're going to get into that. And you can just enjoy it. Maybe you got to get some of those chores done around the house this week. Maybe you got to get all that done before you get the full college football experience back for the last 3 games of the season for Utah. I don't know what it is. Hopefully you're enjoying it all. But we're gonna jump into this week's episode. We got a lot of interesting topics to talk about. Obviously, the college football playoff rankings were released last night, so Tuesday. So we're going to talk about what that means, kind of where Utah stands and all that kind of stuff. A little updated flow chart look. This is obviously Utah's path to the Big 12 title game. And then we'll look at Utah at its second bye week and kind of where they stand and what's upcoming. So before we do that, let me tell you about our partners at Cafe Rio. Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have them ready, hot, fresh, and fast. We've got you covered. Savor the flavor, and order now at CafeRio.com. All right, so let's jump into this. Tuesday night, the college football playoffs initial top 25 rankings were released. Look, just to kind of get this out there from the beginning, these are manufactured, right? Like, they don't really mean anything. It's really just kind of an opportunity for us in the media to be able to talk about things, kind of have a little snapshot of where these are in time. And look, you could compare these to the AP Top 25 and how those don't matter. Like I said, this is really just a snapshot in time, and they should be treated as such. And so there's not really a lot of value in terms of being able to say, okay, this is exactly how, X team is going to get to the playoff. But I think it gives at least a snapshot into or a look into how the committee is viewing certain teams. Now, with that said, look, we still have 4 weeks left in the season. You also have the championship games weeks. That's going to impact that as well. You've essentially got 5 weeks left until the final rankings come out. And so there's going to be a lot of changes. What kind of course corrections are going to be made from the selection committee? Do they feel pressure over a certain team? Those types of things, and we'll see. So, how the rankings stand right now is never really a predictor of how they're going to finish. But at the same time, it's a good a good look into how they are viewed. So before we jump into that fully, the rankings for the Big 12 are as such. So you've got BYU that came in at number 7. You have Texas Tech right behind them at number 8. And then you have Utah, who jumped up to 13. Jumped up meaning they're 4 spots higher than where they are in the Associated Press rankings this week. So clearly there's a lot of value there for Utah. And so I think, the initial take here, one, is that this is a phenomenal spot for the Big 12. The Big 12 is going to be very happy about where they're at. You have 3 teams inside the top 15. Brett Yormark said before the season that he fully expected to have multiple teams in the college football playoffs this year. I don't know if this is how he first saw this shaking out. I would be surprised. Maybe not with Texas Tech, but some other teams. But you look at this, and the Big 12 as it stands is currently in a good spot. Now, will it stay that way? That remains to be seen. Obviously, you have BYU and Texas Tech playing this weekend, so there's going to be some ramifications that come from that game. If both of these teams, play close, and it's a close win, I think the rankings are going to remain pretty close. I don't think you'll see a scenario where either team drops too much, but that's not to say that they can't. I don't think either one of these teams obviously have a bad trajectory, and so there's nothing to indicate that suddenly they're on the downward slope. And so I have to imagine that they're going to remain close. Now, the true telling point there is, whoever loses that game, if they drop, I don't even want to say significantly, but if they drop pretty far, what does that mean for the conference, as well as what does that mean for Utah? Because if they can't exactly drop below Utah, so does that push Utah down and then they bump other players up, or other teams up, excuse me? There's a real scenario there, right? Because you can't necessarily put Utah above either one of those teams. I'm sure they can make a case for it. I'd be really fascinated to find out what that case would be. But Utah is going to go as far as what these teams are. So as much as Utah is 13th, and we'll get into that even more here shortly, they're still going to be dependent on two teams that are in the top 10 right now. So one of those teams is going to drop out of the top 10 most likely, or stay on the cusp of the top 10. As such, what does that do for Utah? So it's not as much as just looking around Utah and seeing who's above them and Utah jumping up. There is some of that. But at the same time, this is something that's going to be very dependent on the two teams above them too. If, BYU has the toughest schedule of this group for the remaining set of games. I mean, they have to play at Texas Tech. They get TCU. They have to go to Cincinnati. That's a tough stretch. And so there's a real potential there where BYU could drop 3 games. I don't see it, but you could drop 3 games, and suddenly, what does that do to Utah's standings? I don't know that would impact it a ton, but it would have some impact knowing that you did lose to the Cougars. So, they're all intermixed, and they're all going to have an impact. And right now, Utah's getting a bump from losing to 2 top 10 teams. Now, part of this is I would say Utah's this high because, one, they're blowing out a bunch of teams, right? But a lot of people are going to look at their resume. They're going to be frustrated by that and say that there's just not anybody of note that Utah's beaten. Now, you can look at that and you can say that Arizona State or Cincinnati are teams that are beaten, but neither one are ranked. I don't fully get into that belief that you have to have wins over ranked teams. I do think it's important. I think that adds a little bit more value, but this is also just subjective things that you put on teams to kind of to weigh who they are. Now, with that said, obviously games against tougher opponents are going to be important, but at the same time, Utah's destroying every opponent they play outside of their 2 losses, and so you're doing exactly what you should to lesser, more inferior competition. So there's kind of a give and take there, right? Like, you do have to play somebody of value, and the 2 teams that you did play of value that you've won are Arizona State and Cincinnati, and we'll still see what their season looks like. You destroyed them. And so I think that there is added value there, and I think that helps kind of erase some of the resume talk, but it's not going to go away. For Utah to have any conversations within the playoffs, that talk is going to remain, and I'll get into that in just a sec. So real quick, looking at the 12-team playoff as it stands right now, how the rankings have shaked out would be that Ohio State receives the number 1 overall ranking, Indiana number 2, Texas A&M 3, and Alabama number 4. So that would be your first round buys. This is different than last year. So last year was the first year of the 12-team playoff, and the way that the NCAA or the College Football Playoff Committee had it was the top 5 conference winners. So usually that's your Power 4 conferences, and then one group of 5, group of 6 now. Champion was going to automatically get a bid into the playoffs, and the 4 teams of those 5 that were ranked the highest would get the first round bye. So last year you had a group of 5 team, Boise State, get a bye, and that came in there. Well, there became some trickiness in there where it wasn't completely favorable. You look at, for example, this year, you've got Ohio State at 1 and Indiana 2. Ohio State would go in with a bye, but in last year's model, Indiana would essentially be a 5 seed. And so it wasn't a full... there wasn't equality. And equality is a bad word because there's not real any equality in the sport. But it wasn't an easy match because now suddenly you've got, some of these teams that are playing essentially the number 2 team in the country, but are ranked 5th or whatever that may be. And so there was just an unbalanced, that's probably a better way, unbalanced way of putting in the rankings. And so this year it's going to be a straight seeding. So essentially it's the, 1 through 4 get the bye. It doesn't matter which conference they're in. In theory, this could be all 4 of the same conference if that's how it shakes out right now. This is a great test for the Power 2 because they got exactly what they want. They've got 2 from the Big Ten and 2 from the SEC that are getting those first-round buys and obviously are the 4 best teams in the country. And then after that, the last 7 teams are just straight seeding. Now, if you watched the rankings or if you've seen the rankings since then, the 5th team, so a group of 5 team, was not even ranked yesterday, excuse me. How that would go is the selection committee will essentially continue through the rankings until they get to the top G6 team. And so as it stands, that looks like Memphis. There's a lot to be learned there. It's most likely coming out of the American Conference, who will claim that spot this year just based on how everything is shaken out. But that's not to say that somebody from the Mountain West couldn't. It just feels like the American is probably where it's going to be. So as it stands, you do have those 4 first-round buys with Ohio State, Indiana, Texas A&M, Alabama. And then those first-round games, you'd get number 5, Georgia, competing against number 12, Memphis. Number 8, Texas Tech. They're hosting, by the way. They're hosting at their own home. Would face number 9, Oregon. That would be a phenomenal game just for the NIL Bowl aspects of it. 2 teams that have invested a ton in NIL, who comes out on top. That would be kind of fun. And then you've got number 6, Ole Miss, hosting against number 11, Texas. And then BYU at number 7 would be hosting against Notre Dame. So Notre Dame would be coming to Novell Edwards Stadium. What a phenomenal environment that would be. So really fascinated to see how that goes. But that's how the initial the rankings have kind of shaken out. This is going to change, right? Like a lot of those teams are probably still going to be in the mix, but as we'll get into in just a second, there's a lot of these teams that have tough games, and so it's not going to be that easy. There's a lot of consternation over Notre Dame being in there, especially with their lack of wins over quality opponents. Their 2 losses are to teams that are below them. It's really interesting. I'm curious to see how that factors in because there may be some value to watch how the committee treats Notre Dame because that could be beneficial to Utah. Let's say a team like BYU or Texas Tech lose. Well, one of these teams is going to lose this week. Is there potential for Utah to jump ahead of them? Maybe. I would be very surprised, as I said, but, looking at Notre Dame, based on how these teams are trending, that can maybe be a case. So as it came out, Utah's obviously number 13. That's a great spot. And so to get into the playoffs, you probably need to be ranked somewhere around 10, 11, somewhere around there to be able to kind of, I don't want to even say guarantee, but the conversation would be much more difficult to leave you out, right? If you're ranked, let's say, 10th in the country, and even though you're the 3rd Big 12 team, I mean, the crazy thing is if 3 teams from the Big 12 are in the top 10, that's kind of, it is what it is. That we're kind of talking in something that's probably not going to be likely anyway, but Utah's going to have to be in a scenario where they have to be up in about 10, 11 range to even have that consideration if they don't make the Big 12 championship game. And so there's a chance here where they could make it not being in the Big 12 championship game, but this feels like the most unlikely scenario just simply because the Big 12 most likely is not going to receive 3 bids into the college football playoffs. 2 teams, it feels favorable right now simply because the Big 12 is being viewed as more favorable than the ACC, which their highest ranked team is number 14, so right behind Utah. So, the ACC has a lot of work to do. In years past, they've been kind of the one that's been a little bit more favored of the ones not included in the Power 2, and now the Big 12 is kind of getting into that realm. So, we'll see how that shakes out. This is going to be a big conversation over the weeks about the Big 12 and the ACC. Does one team or one conference, get in more teams than the other? I think right now it's kind of looking more likely that Big 12 gets 2 at least than the ACC, which may just take a champion, but that remains to be seen. So, we'll see. Now, on the surface, and Josh Newman wrote for me today his mailbag that got into this a little bit more on his take on what it is, and I fall fairly similar to his take in the sense that I just don't see a world where, Utah getting left out of the Big 12 championship game gets a shot at the playoff, but I don't want to say that there's not a spot either. This is... I wouldn't even call it likely, but I would say that there is potential, but there's a lot of things that have to shake out for that to happen, and that becomes a real challenge. Now, the question here is, can you be this year's Indiana? If you remember last year, Indiana essentially played nobody of real substance. They dominated pretty much every single team that they played. They lost only to their only good opponent, which was Ohio State, and they missed out on the Big Ten championship. Sound familiar? Obviously, a different scenario. Big Ten is a little bit deeper, a lot deeper, especially last year. And your 2 top teams were Ohio State and Oregon. This year, it's going to be a little bit different. You're not going to have BYU and Texas Tech, assuming that those 2 are still the ones. I would be surprised if those 2 are the 2 top teams in the country. But you've got 2 teams that are going to be inside the top 10, at least as of right now. And the biggest difference is that Indiana had 1 loss as opposed to 2 that Utah has. So, there's not a real one-to-one translation there. There was a lot of struggle with trying to put Indiana in there last year, and there was a lot of conversation about their resume. But if there is any path, this is the path it has to be. You have to be the Indiana of last year, where you can show that, obviously you were injured against Texas Tech, and not saying that game would have gone any different, but maybe there's a potential where that game's a little bit closer, especially late when Utah could compete a little bit more. Okay, maybe you get that argument. Then you've got BYU. Look, Utah, you can't really throw in the health argument, though Devin Dampier was injured in the 4th quarter. That was more of a coaching decision, and you made a mistake, but that's just 1 loss, and it was a close one, right? And it was to a good BYU team who has now for the last 2 years been good, and so it's not like this was just a flash-in-the-pan team who was hot and then didn't do anything. So there is value in terms of who Utah has lost to, but it's not going to be an easy argument to be on the outside looking in, right? There is some conversation to be had that you have a better chance of getting into the playoff than by being outside of the Big 12 championship than being inside the championship game. My case there most likely is if you go to the Big 12 championship game, you have to win. I doubt you take a 3-loss Utah team, barring this being a really close game. I just think that's a tough look for Utah, which is also why these championship games become a tough metric to judge teams on, and that's why there's been this big push to get championship games out, because you're penalizing a team that, had they not been in that game, would be in there. Now, you could extend these schedules as long as you want, and obviously that's the case, but I think there's a better likelihood here that Utah missing the Big 12 championship game can be ranked higher. Now, that's not easy, but Utah has 3 games that are winnable games. They're games that they should win. And so with that, you finish the season at 10-2. There's not going to be a ton of teams out in the country that are 10-2, but that doesn't mean that you're guaranteed a playoff spot. And so, what is the better path? I don't honestly know. And I think we're going to have to see how this kind of plays out. We're going to have to see how that BYU Texas Tech game goes. We're going to have to see how the teams around Utah play. There's a lot that go into that. But I want to say that there is an outside chance that if you miss the Big 12 championship game, you can still get in. But I just think that's the slimmest of margins. So I think the way that Utah has to still approach this is you have to get to that Big 12 championship game. You still have to win that game. Get your guaranteed spot, don't leave anything in doubt, and kind of go that route. But still, some of that is still outside of their control as well, and that's where it's at. But looking at some of the games that could impact kind of where Utah's at right now, and this is just some of the teams around them, This week alone, obviously, you've got the BYU Texas Tech game, so that's going to have an impact. But you've got 3 teams above Utah that are going to play, games that have some merit. And so you've got number 3 Texas A&M playing number 22 Missouri. I think Texas A&M is probably the better team, but Missouri is a pretty solid team, and you can lose those games. Oregon is going to be playing, so Oregon's number 9. They're going to play number 20 Iowa. Those can be a challenging game, especially if Iowa puts its stamp on the game. And then you've got Notre Dame playing Navy, which Navy's not ranked, but they've been a really solid team this year. All it takes is one game, and suddenly Notre Dame's gone. Look, Notre Dame loses once down the stretch, and they've got at least another tougher game in a couple weeks. Notre Dame loses one game and they're out, right? Like you can say all you want about Notre Dame, but if you don't win one more, or if you lose one more game, you're essentially out. So that's this weekend. You've got those 4 games that are going to be kind of the first test of that, but those aren't really the ones that are going to define. There's a lot more in the remainder of the season that's going to shake out. And one of the first ones there is that Notre Dame versus Pittsburgh game. Pittsburgh comes in ranked 24th. They're 5-0 since they switched their quarterback and suddenly look like one of the hottest teams in the ACC. Pittsburgh honestly controls its own path. They have a very difficult stretch to get there. But if they go on a stretch and dominate these teams that they're playing, or not even dominate but win, they're going to be the team that jumps the most. And that's your biggest worry if you're Utah or the Big 12 in general, of what Pitt can do. If Pitt can go in there and beat these teams and go win out for the remainder of the season, suddenly you now have a more viable candidate for the ACC to kind of squeeze things in and maybe potentially get back to those 2 bids. That would still a bid from the Big 12. What does that look like? So, that's going to be a big game for Pitt. It's also going to be a big game for Notre Dame. As I said, Notre Dame loses and they're out. Next, you've got number 12 Oklahoma playing against number 4 Alabama. That has, implications both ways. Obviously, if Alabama loses, they're going to have a little bit more leeway, but the conversation there probably, there's going to be a conversation there of who Alabama is. But Oklahoma, that's above Utah, and in theory, you lose that game and they're going to drop below Utah. John Mateer looked great before his surgery, but at the same time hasn't looked as dominant. So what does this Oklahoma team look like? Clearly their defense is pretty solid, and so what does that mean? Then you've got number 6 Ole Miss competing against Florida. Now, Florida's not ranked, right? And they're this team that's fired their head coach this year, and it's been a tough situation, but their defense has been pretty solid. They've kept games close. They keep these things within range, and so there's always something tricky about that. Ole Miss has done really well this year. They're balanced on both sides of the ball, but at the same time, do you slip up against Florida, and what does that mean? I don't think that would help their cause at all if you lose to Florida, and I could see them dropping I don't want to say a ton, but they're not going to stay, I could see them dropping outside of the top 10. Then you have Texas, number 11 Texas, going against number 5 Georgia. That's another one of those key games where Georgia has looked shaky a little bit this year at times. They find ways late to kind of come back and just smother teams. It's kind of the Georgia MO, quite honestly, like not fully play all that well the first 2-ish quarters and then just smother teams the second half. Texas obviously looked much better last week, but is the Arch Manning of old going to be playing, or is it the Arch Manning of new? What does that look like? That one obviously has the biggest implications for Utah in the sense that they could drop below. A 3-loss Texas team is not, it shouldn't be considered, quite honestly. I don't see a world where they should be considered, regardless of how good their defense is, that kind of stuff. BYU plays TCU. That one's obviously going to be a tough one, but not huge. But BYU also plays Cincinnati. So there's a few games with BYU that are going to impact Utah. Maybe not necessarily fully in where they are in the rankings, but how Utah's perceived based off of how BYU does, if that makes sense. Couple more games here. You've got Oregon against USC. You've got Pittsburgh versus Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech is 17th. That could be a really interesting one. Georgia Tech is also one of those teams that had been in the top 10 in the AP. They get Pittsburgh and Georgia to finish the season. They could cause all sorts of chaos as well, and that would be entertaining, quite honestly. But you've got 2 teams there that, in Pittsburgh and Georgia Tech, that are vying for a spot in the playoffs, trying to move up. Virginia, quite honestly, doesn't have any games of value. So trying to bump them up above Utah is going to be a difficult task. And so they're not even on this list as challenging games because they don't have anything there. So you've got Pittsburgh and Georgia Tech that have much better path to jumping Virginia simply because of who they play. But, not easy. And then you've got Oklahoma, Missouri, you've got Texas A&M and Texas, and then Oregon and Washington. So there's a lot of games here to kind of look at and kind of get into. So we'll see what happens. There's going to be conversations about Utah's resume. There's going to be conversations about Notre Dame's resume. There's going to be conversations about all these types of things. Just as of right now, it's favorable for the Big 12, right? Like that's where you want to be. And as long as you continue to have favorable spots in these rankings each week, that can benefit you. Now, we'll see what next week brings. I think that's where this really kind of changes the metrics and changes everything for the conference. But, I think, Utah's in a good spot, and, you win those final 3 games, you blow out those, you win those opponents in blowout fashion like you have been, you're still going to be in that mix, and you're going to have a good shot of being able to be in there. The question then remains, do you come in as an at-large outside of the Big 12 championship, or do you go in as a Big 12 champion? How does that look? So really fascinated to see what this is. Don't get too worked up over it right now. There's far too much to go. Like I said, 5 weeks to go before this is really all determined, and the committee changes a ton. So don't get frustrated if you see Utah drop. Don't get frustrated if, Utah is in striking range and they become the Florida State where you don't get in. Now, Florida State was undefeated, so we're not going to make that same comparison. But, there's a lot that can happen in these next 5 weeks. And, the only thing Utah can control is winning their game. So you've got, good games, good competition that are going to be coming into Rice-Eccles Stadium and then going on the road for. But at the same time, the only thing you can control is yourself. And right now, Utah's in a good spot. The rankings are in favorable spots. The ratings in terms of what their stats are has been good. And so it's just really sticking to the game plan and doing what they need. So this week becomes a great opportunity for Utah to recharge, be ready for everything, and know that you're in striking distance to be able to at least have a chance. And that's all you can ask for, if you can have a chance. And I think if you look back on last year, many people forget, which is crazy, many people forget how bad last year was. If you can just be in contention for a playoff spot, I have to imagine that is a great spot for fans and Utah to be in. Sure, you can look at some missteps. You can look at the 4th down decisions against BYU, and you can look at some other decisions that really left some frustrating results on the field, but to turn around a losing season and go 10-2, to have a spot in, conversations for a Big 12 championship, to be able to have a conversation to be in the playoff is good. Now, you obviously want to get into those playoffs, and I understand that, but it's a good spot to be in, and it's not something that you should take lightly because teams just quite honestly don't win 10 games a lot. So, if that's where Utah can get, and if this is a position where they can be in, that's a great spot to be in just from a general perspective in terms of trajectory and what this program can do moving forward. So with that said, let's take a quick jump to the flow charts. This flow chart that I've built has kind of blown up a little bit, and I'm not saying that to kind of toot my own horn. It's just been kind of a little crazy how much it's been taken as kind of the gospel truth. So it's been interesting. I've had many people pull me aside as I go to, my kids' basketball games or whatever that may be, asking me, all of the different questions about it. And I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers, right? This flowchart thing is it's meant to be able to be a simplification of a very complex and convoluted situation. There's so many variables that could go into this that honestly the flowchart doesn't address all of them. And so there's potential that there may be a scenario that I haven't thought of or I haven't worked out. I've tried to work out as many potential scenarios that I can to be able to put it in there. Some of the potential scenarios don't really change the metrics, right? Like you can have, let's say TCU wins out and finishes 7-2. That may depend on what other teams do around them too, and TCU might not have the upper hand, right? Quite honestly, they don't in a lot of scenarios. And so just because I haven't thought of or haven't written down your scenario doesn't mean that it is a way that you can get in there. That's not to say that I haven't missed something. I updated it a bunch last night. I kind of have to do these late at night now because there's edits in live form, and so I've got a bunch of people looking at these daily and pretty frequently, and so I want to make sure that I'm not introducing errors while people are watching. So I do update this. I'm trying to add a little bit more scenarios to try to bring some finality to stuff. For example, I left it in there where, assuming that, let's say BYU goes 7-2 and Utah 7-2, and there's other teams tied with those teams, Utah has a good shot to overtake BYU because of the tied multi-team ties. But, if one of those teams lose or whatever, and you get down to a BYU-Utah, suddenly BYU, overtakes Utah because of head-to-heads. I've tried to add a little bit more context that way. Nothing has really changed. The only real change there is I've found one path where Arizona State has a potential spot at a championship appearance. But most scenarios in that realm go to Utah's way. So if it's not BYU or Texas Tech, or assuming that Cincinnati doesn't lose another game, it's pretty much BYU, Texas Tech, and Utah. Cincinnati, like I said, has a little bit more paths than other teams. Arizona State has a path, but that's pretty much it. There would be a lot more chaos that needs to happen for other teams to get in there, and I just don't quite honestly see that going that way. So Texas Tech essentially locks it up this week as a spot in the championship game if they beat BYU. Their last two games are games that they absolutely should win, West Virginia and UCF, if I remember correctly. Those are games that you shouldn't lose to, but you never really know, right? Like we saw Houston lose this last weekend, and that kind of shook up the chaos meter of these flowcharts and kind of the direction of the conference title games. And so it can happen. Obviously, the second Texas Tech loses its second game, that puts them into a pool of a lot of teams that could essentially lose it for Texas Tech based on kind of how the tiebreakers shake out. So if Texas Tech wins this weekend, there's a high probability that they win out. That's probably the most likely scenario, quite honestly. They're a 10-point favorite with BYU coming to town. BYU gets LJ Martin, and so they're going to be pretty much at full strength, and that's going to be a tough game. And so there's real potential that Texas Tech could lose, but at the same time, it's not a guarantee. But I would say, Texas Tech wins this game, and there's a real, I don't know what odds I'd put on it, but, a 95% chance that they make it to the Big 12 championship game because you just have West Virginia and UCF left. So crazier things have happened, but I would have to imagine that's kind of the scenario. If BYU wins, there's a higher probability that they go undefeated for the season. Yes, you do have TCU, you do have Cincinnati, you have UCF, but if you can beat Texas Tech in a hostile environment, which is quite honestly the toughest defense in the conference, there's a real chance that you can go beat the rest of those teams. Now, once again, that's still a difficult path. It's much more difficult than what Texas Tech has to finish the season. But you get that win, and there's a real probability that they can do that. So, a lot to be learned or gained from this weekend. It has real potential to kind of shake things up a little bit, but for the most part, as I mentioned, it's really going to come down to BYU and Texas Tech as well as Utah, and then some scenarios where Cincinnati and Arizona State get there. That one scenario where Arizona State gets there, I'll tell you that one. So that's a scenario where Texas Tech wins out, a likely scenario. BYU loses a second game, but it can't be to Cincinnati, so it's most likely to TCU. So BYU loses to TCU. They could still lose to Cincinnati, but Cincinnati would then have to lose a second game to Arizona or TCU, and so there's some chaos there. But then, what am I going at? Oh, yes. And then if Cincinnati, they would have their second loss, that essentially puts them in there, and then Arizona State wins out. TCU has to lose one more game, and that would essentially be Texas Tech and Arizona State. So there is potential there for an Arizona State path. That one is also not that likely. They have a tough path as well. A lot of these teams, Houston, TCU, Arizona State, Cincinnati, they have some really tough games. Utah has the easiest path to be able to win out next to Texas Tech after they face BYU. But there's not a lot of variance there. So really curious to see how this all shakes out. If you want to see that, I've got it pinned on my Twitter account, X account, whatever we want to call it these days. You can see it there. I've obviously posted it on my stories on KSL.com. I've most recently published it to Josh's mailbag, so you can see it there. This is something that I'll try to update as best as possible with the scenarios, try to make sure that we're kind of giving an updated look, but it's not going to be perfect, right? There is some scenarios where I probably haven't thought about it, and maybe I'm mistaken. So use that as a caveat that it's most likely correct, but I just, without a computer to do all of the possible scenarios out there, I can't get all of that. So it is what that is. So let's take a little break now to tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. At Canyon View Credit Union, it's on the house. Close a mortgage and get a free appraisal up to $600. To learn more details or apply, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, let's finish out the episode today with talking a little bit about where Utah stands. Utah obviously comes away in the bye week with a 45-14, win over Cincinnati. The game started out close. Cincinnati, is a pretty solid team and did really well, but Utah just kind of ramped it up and really took over and destroyed another opponent. So, that had a lot of value for Utah, just not only for another valuable opponent who was undefeated in Big 12 play, but you also shake off the college game day vibes where people think that Utah can't win in college game day. And sure, the record hadn't been great for Utah, but, you get that opportunity where you're now 500 in college game day games. You established yourself in every facet that you needed to. The run game was efficient. The passing game was efficient. Ryan Davis goes for 132 yards, 1 touchdown, and 8 catches. Just has been a phenomenal player for Utah. I remember some of the conversation when he transferred to Utah. He was kind of overlooked, right? Like a lot of people looked at him and his production at New Mexico and really just didn't see him as the prototypical wide receiver one. They didn't think that he could be valuable. You looked at somebody like a Tobias Merriweather or a Larry Simmons who, is a little taller, has a little bit more of the characteristics of what you would want in a wide receiver. And so Ryan Davis kind of got overlooked. And I think there's a lot of people that have changed there should be a lot of people that have changed their tune a lot on what he's done. His catch radius is fairly significant. He's bringing down pretty much every ball. This last game, he was targeted 9 times and brought down 8. And I believe the 9th time, I forgot to go look this up, but the 9th time was a ball that wasn't really catchable for him. And so, he's bringing down pretty much everything that comes in his range. And that's exactly what you need. Now, look, this Utah passing has not been prolific, right? Like, this isn't something where Utah's going into games and absolutely dominating opponents with the passing game, but it hasn't needed to be, right? Because they've been able to be effective in their run game, puts up 267 yards against a Cincinnati team that is ranked something like 85th in the country, probably a little higher before this game, if I remember right. But, did really well to be able to compete against Cincinnati, which is a good team, and gave Utah another chance to be able to keep the dreams alive of being able to be in the Big 12 championship game. So, really, really fascinating season and how this has developed. There's some of those things where early on Jason Beck had talked about we may not know exactly what we have, and then you get into the season and you kind of hone in on it. Utah has absolutely honed in on it. They know what their strength is, and that's running the ball. And they're doing exactly what they need to be able to get there. They're also sprinkling in enough of the passing game to be efficient. It's still something where you would love to have more contributors, right? Like Dallin Bentley has been a great contributor. J.J. Buchanan has been a great contributor. But you need more pass catchers, in that room. And Larry Simmons is coming along. If you can get him to kind of be another factor there and really move forward, that's going to help this Utah team. If Utah gets to the playoffs or if Utah gets to the championship game, this is that area where Utah has to kind of take that next step. They can be effective running the ball, but for example, if they play Texas Tech in the championship game, we saw how effective Texas Tech was at stopping the run. And so you've got to be able to have a little bit more there. Devin Dampier obviously is coming off of his injury. He looked better. I wouldn't say that he looked 100%. I know he's not 100%. But at the same time, I think he's doing enough that's giving Utah a chance to win. Bird Ficklin came in at the end of the game, scored another touchdown. It feels like every single time he touches the ball, he's getting a touchdown, whether passing or rushing or whatever that may be. I mean, he's been a great asset for Utah and doesn't really stop the momentum, right? Sometimes you get that QB2 in there and they're just there to take handoffs or whatever that may be. I mean, Bird gets in there and he keeps it at a high level. And this Utah team continues to be effective in what they do with him running the ship. So good situation for Utah. Obviously, like, you would love to have a little bit more passing, as we've talked about all year. But I think this Utah team is just embracing a lot of who it is. They're finding new players to get involved in there. Daniel Bray has obviously been involved. Wayshawn Parker is really taking the next step. This is back-to-back games now with over 100 rushing yards. He's really kind of come onto his own and really showcasing his talent. You've got a lot of different players that are able to be a factor in this team. Now, with that, we've read a bunch of these offensive stats. We've talked about how their success rate is great. We've talked about their ability to get a push on the offensive line. I'm not going to regurgitate that this week. We all know it. I think there's no real value to keep coming back to that. And I could go deep on other areas, but I'm gonna spare you. This time I'm gonna look a little bit at some of the standard stats, but kind of to show how Utah has dominated this year. So, for example, Utah is averaging 39.6 points per game this year. That's 10th in the country. Obviously really solid, but you've got other teams that are just putting up more. But really solid, especially with where they're at. But conversely, you have a team that is allowing only 14.2 points to opponents. Now, we've grown accustomed to Utah being solid against opponents and their defense obviously being great every single year. But I wanted to see kind of how this number stacked up. And look, we're not to the end of the season yet, so there's other games that are going to factor in. You're going to get bowl games or a bowl game that factors into that. If they're in the playoffs, that is going to factor into it. But you've got a team right now, as it stands, this would be the lowest points that the Utes have allowed since 1969, when they allowed 10.7 points for opponents. That's quite a while. That's before I was born. That's quite a while before I was born. But this is a team that the closest to that is 15 points in 2019. That was one of Utah's elite defenses. Obviously really solid. That was the year that Utah really had a playoff shot when it was 4 teams, and then ended up losing in the championship game, and obviously we saw what happened there. But that's the closest that any team has been, is that 2019 team at 15 points. Utah is under that at 14.2. And I think we sometimes, clearly Utah's dominated on the offensive side of the ball, and I think there's been a lot of attention placed on the offense this year for good reason, especially with what happened last year and the year before that. But you've got a defense that is absolutely doing its best to be able to limit scoring. And it's been efficient. It's been effective. There's sometimes some bend but don't break mentalities there. But for the most part, this is a team that is limiting teams from scoring. And some of those teams have scored a lot in the red zone in games prior to Utah. And so this isn't, you're just playing terrible competition. There is some of that. You are not playing a great competition at times. But there's been some good teams, Arizona State and Cincinnati, for example, that have been able to put up a lot of points, or in previous games that Utah's been able to limit. So, pretty impressive effort to be able to have the lowest scoring defense since 1969 at Utah. A great situation. That shouldn't go unnoticed. But then on the same side, you pair that with the scoring, and it's a completely different game, right? I didn't go all the way back to see when the highest was for Utah in scoring, but I have to imagine, I don't know that it's similar, but it's another one of the high ones. For example, 2022, Utah averaged 38.6 points per game, so that was the second year of their Pac-12 championship run. 2021 was 36.1 points. So you're putting up more points than both of those seasons. The 2019 season was 32.3 points. I mean, the fact that you're averaging 40 points per game and it's remained pretty consistent for the entirety of the season shows kind of the level that Utah's been on this year. So clearly they weren't there with BYU and Texas Tech, but you kept it close against BYU in an emotional game. The Texas Tech one is going to skew things a little bit in terms of the margin, but for the most part, I mean, this has been a pretty solid season on both sides of the ball for Utah. And when you look at, I try to retweet some of these charts that I'm not doing, but some other people that are much better at statistical, looks. There's, the one that I retweeted the other day showed that Utah is one of the best teams in the country in both offense and defense. And so when you pair those, it said that Utah would be a playoff team just based off those alone. So that's why a lot of the value of these stats has been helping Utah. Obviously, the results, the things that you see on the field stand out as well. It's not like Utah's squeaking by these teams and then you look like a good team that way. This is an all-around effort from Utah where the stats are backing up what you see on the field as well, which doesn't always happen. So there's that. Rushing. This one is a pretty impressive stat. And it's not fully complete, and so it's hard to know where this can be. But as it stands right now, Utah is currently at 2,400 yards. It's 2,404 to be exact. And they've rushed for 27 touchdowns this season. Now, as a comparison, last year, Utah finished with 1,565. That's all the rushing yards that they got. So you already topped that. And this is the most mind-boggling thing. Every time I look at it, I'm still like, it boggles my mind that this is where we were at last year. They finished with 7 rushing touchdowns last year. Utah's topped that by 20 touchdowns, 20 rushing touchdowns this year. I think Nakari Rogers has 7 touchdowns himself rushing. So, I mean, I think clearly it shows that it wasn't just a passing situation for Utah last year. They couldn't run the ball, and it was just an overall just defunct room on the offense. So, doing really well, but those numbers that Utah's at right now, rushing, is higher than the 2023 season, which was at 2,373, and it's on par with, honestly, most seasons for Utah where their rushing numbers are. They're sometimes 2,500, 2,800, somewhere around there, but Utah in 9 games is at 2,400 rushing yards and 27 touchdowns. Now, if you kind of look at their average and continue to kind of project it forward just through a 12-game season, they're going to get a bowl game, so you're going to at least get one more. And bowl games are tough anymore because you've got opt-outs, different things that way. But if you just took their average and projected it forward through 12 games, they're finishing at 3,200 yards and 36 touchdowns. Now, the highest of all time, and Utah's only rushed for 3,200 yards one time in school history, and that took place in 1984 when they rushed for 3,263. If you extrapolate that and get it to a bowl game, there's a high probability that this is gonna be a record-breaking season for the Utes. So this has clearly been a great season for the run game. It's not just one where clearly they're dominating teams because they've been able to run the ball well. This is ones where this is their emphasis, right? This is what they do, and they've honed in on it, and it's been a phenomenal season. They've got at least 3 guys that have been able to be effective there with Wayshawn Parker, Nakari Rogers, and now Daniel Bray. That's not even mentioning, Bird Ficklin or Devin Dampier or any of the other hosts of players that have been able to be in the run game. This is a team that they went in. They came in with a game plan. As Utah scouted and as they went into the transfer portal, this is the kind of emphasis that they went for, right? Like, they found guys that they could build around. They had a consistent scheme. They had a consistent theme even. We're going to, I guess, rhyme that. But it was something that they focused in on and knew what they needed to be to have their identity work. And it absolutely has worked. And that's, I think, the most important thing for Utah. Now, they're averaging 267.1 yards per game, which is second only to that 1984 team, which was 271.92. So you're right on that edge. Look, we'll see. Either way, it's still pretty much a record-breaking season. Who knows if they'll get over those 3,200 yards. There's still 3 games to go in the regular season. I will say your next 3 opponents, which I'll get to in a sec, aren't that great against the run, so that bodes well for you. But A pretty stellar season. The 22 and 21 seasons, so the two Rose Bowl seasons, Utah rushed for 3,000 yards in each of those seasons. They were pretty identical almost. One year was 30-47, the other was 30-41. One year was 38 touchdowns, the other was 37. Both of those are the second and third highest all time. So, Utah's in that realm where they are in those types of seasons, right? And so it's been a pretty effective run. But as it stands, if everything continued to move forward, they would break that 1984 season. So pretty impressive. And the fact that they're at those 2,400 yards right now at 9 games into the season kind of shows what they've done this year. Now, when it looks at passing, it's pretty low in terms of kind of what they need to be. If you were to extrapolate it forward, it would be 2,500 yards and 24 touchdowns. Not a bad spot to be, but it's not the spot where, you're looking at that and saying, oh, we need more. But at the same time, you're averaging 39, almost 40 points a game. Like, I don't know that there's really anything Utah can do better. Sure, maybe you get more drives because you pass more and so you score more quickly. But Utah's done really well to have some balance there where they're scoring quickly, within 3 minutes, 3-4 minutes. And they're also having drives that extend the run. You're getting the guys out there. You're wearing down the clock, still playing kind of Utah's ball where you try to milk the time of possession. I mean, this has been a team that has been effective in kind of whatever approach that they need to be in. So you can look down at the passing numbers right now, and I think that's fine. I think it's going to be an okay situation, and it's not something to worry about. So really solid all around. I mean, when you look at the yards per play, Utah's at 6.3 yards per average. That's, lower than some seasons that Utah's had more success. So like 2022, 21, or even 2019. So I look at those 3 seasons, kind of those dominant years. The high was a 6.59. I mean, you're right on pace there, but I think some of those seasons had a little bit. Well, I know some of those seasons had a little bit more passing with Cam Rising and with in that 2019 with Tyler Huntley. So you were a little bit more. You were emphasizing the passing a little bit more, but I think Utah's been much more explosive this year and more dominant. And then you pair that with that defense that we talked about, and Utah's been pretty solid. So it's just been an overall dominant effort on both sides of the ball. There's obviously something that you can complain about every single week and point to and say that Utah needs to do this, but that's many teams. There's very few teams in the country where you can look at and say they don't have a weakness. And if they don't, they're probably the number 1 or 2 teams in the country, right? And that's just kind of the nature of it. Those are those teams that have a legitimate shot at winning a national championship. That's not to say that Utah, if they get into playoffs, can't make a run, but I just, you've got to have a little bit more in the tank. And I don't say that in the sense that like Utah can't get there. But it is what it is. Look, Utah has their own problems before they even get in the conversations of can they win a playoff game. And if they get to those conversations, we can have that conversation. So just real quick, looking at the final 3 opponents that Utah has. So Utah obviously travels to Baylor this next week. They get the bye this week, so they'll get a chance to see how things go, get a rest and see everything there. But you get Baylor next week, then you come home for senior night against Kansas State, and then you go back out on the road to Kansas. All of these games Utah can lose, right? So don't take this as, these are guaranteed wins for Utah. Baylor's offense is decent. Their defense has not been great, and that's been their huge liability. But that's been the case for all 3 of these teams. The offense at Kansas State can score. They can do well and kind of put some pressure on you, but their defense has not been great. And so, all of these games have potential to get Utah, especially if they're caught, overlooking that, or especially if Utah gets a little bit more love in the playoff rankings and it really does look like things are shaking out that they can get into the playoff or into the Big 12 title game. I mean, there's real potential there that things can change. I don't get that sense from this team. I think they stayed dialed in. But we have seen in the BYU game or the Texas Tech game where things can kind of change and be altered. So we'll see. But looking at this, just looking from the rushing yards alone. So honing in on Utah's strength versus, the opponent's defense in terms of rushing, this absolutely benefits Utah. So, for example, Baylor is allowing 177.6 yards in the run game. They rank 111th. That has potential where Utah can absolutely do what they want in the run game, and just be able to kind of have a field day on that and put it up. That is, that's worse than, West Virginia. That's worse than, it's not quite to Colorado's level. Colorado is one of the worst in the country in rush defense, especially after the last 2 weeks. But, it's not great. Kansas State allows 152.8 yards per game in the run game. That's 78th. That's more aligned with what Cincy is averaging. So it's going to be pretty similar to what Cincinnati is, West Virginia, those types of teams that are there. So you've got that. And then lastly, you finish the season at Kansas, where they are allowing 170 exactly yards per game in the run game for 103rd in the country. So you've got a lot of potential to have your best strength be the focus of the season, the rest of the season, I should say. That's a great opportunity for Utah. But look, Utah has everything in front of them, and they still may not get there, but they can't be caught kind of sleeping and looking forward, right? This is a chance for Utah to have a path to the Big 12 championship game. This is a path to the playoffs. It's a path to be able to finish the season with a 10-2 record. All three of those things, if only one of those come about, the 10-2, I guess I would say, is still going to be a solid season. And so you want to finish strong. It's not good enough to just finish, 7-3 or 7. What is the number? 7 we're at 7-2 right now. 7-5. There we go. That would be a disaster, finishing the last 3 games that way. And I don't think that'll be the case, but you can't go in there and lose a game. You can't slip up. This has to be a season where, 10 has to be kind of the look. And if you can get to 10-2, the rest will play out the way that it needs to. If you're in the Big 12 championship game or in the playoffs, great. All that's more gravy. But I think if you can get to 10-2, that should be considered a successful season. Obviously, there will be disappointment that you didn't get into any of those postseason things, and you're playing in a bowl game that you're not as excited about. But that has to be a win. That has to be a scenario where Kyle Whittingham can feel good with what he's built and kind of leave on a high note, and really help things. So there's a lot on the table here. There's a lot left to go, but there's a real favorable spot for Utah, and we'll see how it shakes out. But, enjoy the weekend. Enjoy the opportunity where you get to sit back and not have to stress about your team. Now you can just stress about all the other teams around them needing to help Utah. Who do you want this week? Texas Tech, BYU. Which do you think is going to be more favorable for you? Those kinds of things. But those, that's not as stressful as watching your team play, I guess. So enjoy the weekend. Have fun. Go do some chores. Be a good individual, whatever that may be. I don't know what that means for you, but just go have fun. It's a fun weekend. Enjoy it, and we'll get back at this. We'll get back at the grind next week as we preview Baylor. And we'll have a fun time talking about them and seeing what a game was supposed to be, and have some fun with it. So with that, we'll sign out. Have a great day.